Bien, buenas tardes. Vamos a seguir.
Very well, good afternoon. We shall continue with the day with the presentation of a panel that is especially interesting, and its moderation will be in charge of Dr. Leonardos. And please, if you can project a presentation video. Main challenges in the use of intangible assets as a source of financing. We have Matías Alemán from the Worldwide Organization of Intellectual Property, OMPI, from Switzerland. We have Allan and JarryIP, SPA Chile. Fernando Gastelbondo, CompassBranding, Colombia. The moderator, Gabriel Leonardos, ABPI, Brazil. Good afternoon to all of you. It is a matter of pleasure to be able to be here in ASIPI. I want to thank the organizers for this kind invitation. We have a magnificent workshop, and surely you will be as impressed as I am. And we will begin because time is short and the quality of these speeches are excellent. We must treat a very interesting topic which will have a lot of development throughout the next years. In this workshop, ASIPI is in the forehead as always, to be able to have a position of leadership in a topic that I believe has the strength of changing all the topic of intellectual property around the world. Matías Alemán studied in the Javeriana University here in Colombia, where he obtained a corporate law certificate, and he also obtained a diploma in studies based in investigation from the University Alcalá in Spain, and he is a doctor in rights since 2011, also by the University of Alcalá with a magna cum laude. Mr. Alcalá practices an IP attorney from 91 to 95. He was named the head of the National Institution of Intellectual Property in Colombia from 95 to 98. He was a fellow visiting researcher in the Institute Max Planck of Munich. And from there, I have had the honor of having finally something in common with Dr. Marco Alemán, because I was also there in 2 years in the decade of the 80s. I'm a bit older than him. And very well, he's been in OMPI since 1999, where he had many positions, and currently he has the position of Director Assistant, that is littering the IP and innovation ecosystem sector. Yes, Marco, please go ahead. Very well, good afternoon to all of you. Gabriel, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm pleased to be able to share the panel with such distinguished speakers. The presentation is foreseen to be 15 minutes, which will also give us some times at the end for some Q&A, and what pretends to be an introductory speech that will allow, it's an introductory speech that will allow my fellow speakers to continue with a technical topic as assessment, and the other one based on the real experience from the company optic in these topics of the usage of intellectual property as intangible assets. Very well, so let us begin with some topics which I believe might be fundamental. Now, the first thing is that it's clear that companies need capital to be able to grow and be able to advance. But it's also clear that there are important challenges in the access to funds. Some global reports, as the ITC, demonstrated how throughout the pandemic, the companies that didn't count with the access to funds, were the ones that disappeared. We believe that the integration of intangible assets as a mechanism of access towards these financial resources is important And it could be the way to reduce that financial gap that currently exists on behalf of many companies that, just as I mentioned, have difficulties of access to financial resources. These intangible assets could back up, on one side, the debt, which means to be used as a mechanism that backs up the debts, and it could also be mechanisms used for the access towards capital. Both of them are mechanisms, in my opinion, that are available around the usage of these assets of intellectual property. But let's look at some elements that could bring an illustration of where we are at the moment. The first element is that's clear that the intangible assets move our economies. Let's look at some points that will illustrate this statement. The first one is that it's clear that the chain values have become in the visible face of the world trade. In a study that we made in OMPI in 2017, that is reported as the World Intellectual Property Report in 2017, points out that intellectual property, and especially the intangible assets, contribute the double of the tangible capital and the value of the products that we consume. And it was used as an example, the iPhone 7 in 2017, where the analysis of the contribution of the intangible assets in each sold iPhone would contribute in a value approximate of 42% of the market product that was estimated in $809 per iPhone, which means that from those $809 of each iPhone 7 that was purchased, 42% corresponded to intangible assets. It is clear that the global value of the intangibles has multiplied in an amazing way, and it has been multiplied by 10 in the last 25 years to be able to reach the number of $74 billion in 2021. An indicator that from a point of view is amazing is the value of brands. And let's take the first 5,000 brands around the world, and if we value them, we will see that the value of these brands are above $12.5 billion, which shows a significant growth in $1.5 billion compared to the previous year. It is clear then that the intangible assets have within our economies a fundamental role. Now, the question underlies in how can we use it? So it becomes an additional source of financial resources. Here, I want to point out three that we will be looking very quickly and that I do expect you can read within this table and the chart. But without a doubt, I know that this presentation will be distributed as well afterwards. But here we have three mechanisms. The first one, the usage of intellectual property, is a direct warranty. Second, the usage of intellectual property through titling. And third, the sale with rent. Three mechanisms where we use intellectual property, where we look for benefits that are above than the economical advantage, the competitive advantage that it produces the exclusive right. We, especially attorneys, we always repeat that the great advantage of intellectual property is that exclusive right that without a doubt has a fundamental value for its owners. But what we look for is that additionally it could also have other roles. And we believe that within the economy that we move on, that other role or one of those other roles are to precisely facilitate the access towards capital. Now, let's take the case. I won't develop all of them, but let's take the case of direct warranty. Now, intellectual property helps as the warranty, the guarantee of a credit. At the moment that you access a credit, you use the right of intellectual property as a mechanism of warranty towards that credit. Now, which is the function of intellectual property? In this case, the intangible assets would allow for those income flows that are attained through the intellectual property to be that warranty, that of the mechanism of payment towards those credits. Now, which is the advantage, without any doubt, in the case that the loaner doesn't pay the credit, the bank entity will be able to count with that intangible assets for the effects of receiving the payment. And it works the same in the other categories. For example, the last one, selling with rent, is a category that appears intensively or being used intensively as a strategy of access to financial resources in China. And without a doubt, I believe Well, and you will notice when we analyze in different options that it will give us some guidelines of what could be done in other jurisdictions. Now, not everything is easy. There are some challenges. And without a doubt, for intellectual property to work as a mechanism of access for these financial tools, the first mechanism is that the intangible assets are very difficult to be valued. And there are different reasons for this. The first one, and from my point of view, the most complex one, is that intellectual property, the context, is fundamental. It's not the same to value the patent of a company that's already constituted and that operates, and where we know that technology, of course, gives a competitive advantage in the market, than valuing the technology of a company that is just in the formation stage, like a startup. So the context is accounted in intellectual property. That's one of the reasons. The second one is that I believe that one of the difficulties in the assessment of intangibles are the diverse rules from one country to another and from one region to another. I do believe that in certain occasions when we compare different values of intangible assets, we might see how over a same asset there were immense discrepancies in assessments that have been done by experts, each one of them having an immense scientific merit in the assessment, but show great disparity. The second requisite is that in certain occasions, those that loan the money, banks and other stakeholders, the investors and other loaners, do not know a lot about intangible assets. It's much more easy to make operations over tangible because over intangible there are many years of experiences in these kind of transactions. The main challenge in this case is that through dialogue with these entities, these financial entities, the topic of intellectual property can transform itself into a more known topic. The third requisite is that the regulators do not promote the usage of the intangible as warranties. One of the main functions of the entities of regulation, and one of the most known rules denominated as Basilea III, which is one of the financial rules that regulate the financial operations, try to look for the financial systems to not assume any risk or assume the lowest risk as possible to be able to guarantee the stability of the sector. With these rules, in great measure, looking for that financial stability, they do not stimulate the usage of intangible assets as a warranty of credit because they consider that within them the risk could be high. And there is where I believe that we need a work that allows to revise some of these normative frameworks. The costs of transactions within the usage of intangible assets are quite high. We need to make a due diligence. We need to make an assessment of those intangible assets. We need to adopt those warranty measures, and it's very possible that if there is no payment, the execution of these intangibles will also be complex. The costs of these transactions are not low. If we add the fact that many of the operations are global, this would also imply that many contracts that are relative to the usage of intangible as a warranty require possibly a formalization amongst different offices of intellectual property and other control authorities. Finally, what I already mentioned around the difficulty in the liquidation of these intangibles. When it is used as a warranty, its liquidation on behalf of the loaner in case of a payment is relatively simple. When it's a vehicle, an apartment, or a farm, the financial entity could go to the secondary market to try to liquidate that collateral. But talking about an intangible asset, it becomes more complex. In certain jurisdictions where there is a secondary market, it will become easier to make a liquidation. But in jurisdictions where there is a secondary market of intangibles, it becomes complex. Please notice that some of these challenges could be borne in a short term, but many others, on the contrary, will require a coordinated work internationally and possibly as well a long term. Under this context, the OMPI has made different analysis, and here I want to make a general description around some modules that we could put in March with the purpose of finding solutions to the topic of financing through the path of intangible assets. For example, valuing the costs of transactions, the lack of experience or knowledge as a mechanism of search for a higher liquidity, and the difficulty in liquidation could also be an effective actions like mechanisms of assistance and support into the valuing. Some countries like Jamaica, just to call some examples in the region, have a lot of examples with the support of the Inter-American Bank of Development, where they have created capacity within the country, so there are experts in the valuing of intangibles, just to call an example within this region. Sensitizing with banking entities or credit entities would also be, without a doubt, a mechanism with the effect of solving the problem and the lack of knowledge. And you will notice that each one of these issues that I have quoted before have a mechanism of solution. For example, amongst the high risk of the financial entities, we could experiment issues like insurance of entities, of insurance entities. An insurance entity could assume the risk of a lack of payment of the owner of that intangible asset, and that way reduce the risk of the financial entity. Now, well, what I try to mention with this plot or this graphic is that to each one of these issues there is a possible solution. Now, what has OMPI done? OMPI has a work plan that is what I'm presenting, that is based on 3 pillars. On one side, we considered that a fundamental role is to give a greater visibility to what's happening in the topic of financing and the financing of intangible assets on the field. In this sense, we have started a number of projects or investigation projects in different countries with the purpose of generating national reports that would document the situation of the use of the intellectual property as a source of financial resources. 15 national reports have been done, and I will be showing later on one of these reports. That's one that is published in the page of OMPI, but there are other 14 that are in a stage of elaboration, very advanced in these topics: England, Korea, Switzerland, Brazil, and Latin America, amongst others. The second component is to effectively show that within the field, what is happening is already producing different types of outcomes. What we have done is a relationship between these 2 points, 1 and 2, with the purpose of doing this, the following. To show visibility, we've had the first global meeting, a conversation of a high level amongst experts, where we were able to board, amongst others, the first results of those studies that we have performed within these countries that I was previously mentioning, and be able to analyze what has been done, for example, in Korea, where through a government fund, the risk has been diminished so that financial entities can give credits using as a collateral intellectual property, which is a concrete example of an action that has been implemented in a country. And finally, we would be trying to prepare the participants, which means the financial entities and the companies, so they can count with a tool that allows them to use intellectual property as a source of financial resources. For this, we have 2 manuals, 2 guides, one for the financial entities, banks, insurance companies, and others, where they explain how intellectual property can be used as a collateral, and on the other side, a guide that is directed to small and medium companies that indicate these small and medium companies, which are the elements that have to be considered if they want to use intellectual property as a source of financial resources. In this sense, this is one of the reports, Report of Singapore, where they report clearly what was done in Singapore so that intellectual property could become a source of financial resources, from schools where they train accountants so they can be assessors in intellectual property, up to government actions to promote knowledge and intellectual property amongst the different entities of credit. Now, within OMPI, we can also directly support the the center of referee of the OMPI through the rules of what we call the expert determinations, where they use global experts in valuing, where one of them can request the OMPI that through the path of one of these experts, they can assess an asset that is pretended to be used in an activity of venture capital or a financial activity, like it could be, for example, the usage of the asset as a collateral. We had this high-level meeting that I mentioned before, where we had the participation of more than 350 global experts, development banks, private banks, government authorities, offices of intellectual property, businessmen, where we had a conversation of that list of challenges that I mentioned before and the possible actions that I also mentioned before, with the purpose of identifying where we currently are. For example, we were able to identify that some development banks that want to use intellectual property as a warranty of collateral credits in reality are not doing this. They are acting just as the venture capitals do in their transactions, which is taking the company altogether, be able to identify the potential, and afterwards decide if they give or not a particular credit. But intellectual property per se is not the determining factor in the grant of this credit. I believe that is there where we have an important space, and we have the fortune that many of the members of this meeting came from development banks of a regional size. Now, these kind of banks are main stakeholders in a fundamental piece within this discussion because of one reason. And it's that on one side, these development banks assume the risk of supporting the development, and therefore they want to rise that risk that other private stakeholders will possibly not assume. I believe that this is where we have a formula that could be explored. Afterwards, we had very punctual meetings, and the first of these meetings was given over the topic of filmmaking. We invited different actors of the filmmaking industry of North America, and we also invited some young filmmakers, and we told them how it is that in filmmaking, the intellectual property is being used as a collateral. How it is in the case of certain movie producers, that through a script or through a title, taking the correct measures, they could be able to gather numbers of 10, 15, up to $25 million for a filmmaking production using these intangible assets as a collateral. And what is it when what doesn't happen in other cases, like in the case of the use of trademarks or patents as collateral? And from this meeting with the movie industry, we saw through a global study, through interviews and surveys around the world, we could see which are the main learnings and what can be also applied in other disciplines. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Marco. Agora vamos a ouvir Allan Jarry.
Thank you, Marco. Now we will listen to Allan Jarry. Allan is an engineer, a commercial engineer that has studied in the PUC, the Pontificia Universidad Católica from Chile. He has a master's degree of intellectual property from the Franklin Pierce Institute. One more, because yesterday we met many of them here. He's an MBA, an expert in brands, patents, intellectual property, a portfolio of R&D, with more than 30 years of practice in intellectual property. He is the founder of JarryIP, that is focused on and he is strategic in the management of the firm. He specializes in designing IPM strategy for clients for the property management, for the property treatment portfolios, including other IP railings derived from other activities.
Transfer and licensing, having founded and chaired the Chilean LES chapter. Ahí tengo algo, entonces.
There I have something in common with Allan, because I was also the founder of the chapter of Brazil in this case, so great. And now I'm just expecting to be able to read the one of Fernando and be able to discover something new. He is an agile researcher the board member of a venture capital fund that makes investment in multiple areas of innovation. Allan, please, we're full of curiosity to listen what you have to say. Thank you, Gabriel. Fernando, Marcos, it is a matter of pleasure to be able to share with you. I understand that we're still in the second time of football, so thank you very much to all of you for being here. And I thank you for seeing this game. Are we still 4-0? Brazil is amazing. 4-1 now. Oh, okay, it's 4-1. 4-1. Okay, equally. Brazil is a giant. So it is great to be here. And when I was invited, this topic is a bit challenging to talk about, a topic that is still quite incipient. And I believe that in that speech that Marco gave us, we can see that there are still many challenges that we all recognize. There's still a lot to do, but also, as Gabriel said in his introduction, there's a tremendous potential that if we achieve this, there's a great industry that can have a huge revolution around intellectual property from the point of view of financing of all types of things. In this sense, I was called, as I'm the NGO and the less political in the field, and my role is to take all of this and landing to see what's happening nowadays in three areas: banks, venture capitals, or startups or SMEs. And this is what I'm going to try to reflect. It's not good news, but it's just a swipe of reality in terms of what Marco is doing in the OMPI. And precisely due to this reality is why we need to impose so many things. So we can all share that there is a quantity of information, data. There is a data that we might all agree that something is happening. The first one is that there is a definitive transition to this knowledge-based economy, a new economy based on knowledge that for certain years has been growing with strength, and I still believe that it has a lot to be developed on. And this means that definitely each time more the value of the companies are focusing towards their intangible assets and therefore the rights that protect them. These could be brands, know-how, industrial secrets, patents of innovation for growth. These are elements that are adding into the value of a company. An excellent example of this would be Alibaba, iTunes, Uber. Uber is one of the biggest companies of transportation around the world, or Alibaba, one of the main companies of retail trading that doesn't have a store, as Uber doesn't have specific taxis. So in this economy, I know that there are elements that you all recognize, but the topic is really tough. The reality bites imply that when we go to see what's really happening, and when we look specifically within a region, the news are not very cheering in terms of what you could see around in that small research that I made. Please remember that I was focused in the banking industry and venture capital and in certain startups that we will talk about. In the banking industry, what is happening in terms of having intangible assets or rights of intellectual property as the base of warranties or collaterals and operations of credit loans is really low, just to not say that in certain countries of the region are basically null. And specifically in the case of Chile, and I clarify that it's Chile, we have a bank that is a great plaza bank and that consulted an interviewing executive of a high level. Let's say that the reaction was very clear, and it was very, very hard for the framework of these challenges that we have. The first answer was, we have not generated one credit that has been leveraged by a brand. That was a direct quoting. I have never seen it in a medium company, in a big company, or in corporates. And this is a person that manages different areas in a bank, and it's something that has never appeared in a bank that has a relative importance in the Chilean industry. We also spoke about this in the breakfast, that the banking industry in Chile is quite sophisticated. They are quite well developed, and therefore this is a good sample that probably in the rest of our region this is not happening. And even more important, the CMF, which is the entity that regulates the banking and financial industry in Chile, does not recognize the brand as a real warranty. And this brings a problem in terms of what is the exchange in banking. So definitely the reality of the banking industry in Chile is that this is really not happening. We're still far away of being able to do something in these terms. Now, when we advance towards the venture capital industry, this hits in a different way. And Marcos mentioned this as a data. The venture capital, the investment in stages in companies of an early stage, in a certain way considers intellectual property within the due diligence of its assessment. And in a way of understanding the size, a statistic of AFCA, which is the Latin America Venture Association, indicates that only the first half of the year 2021, the industry of venture capital in Latin America invested $6.8 billion in technological startups in the region. This is just to have an idea that we are talking about something that is important in terms of volume. And important parts of these decisions of investment are based on intellectual property. This compared to 2019, just to see the growth, where in all 2019, almost 4.8 billion were invested. Now, when we move specifically into how the due diligence operates of a process of a fund of investment of venture capital or a network of investors, of angels, some of you that know me know that I'm linked to a small fund that is in Chile for the region, but the process considers different kind of variables. Obviously, here we have some of them, and so of course this speech doesn't have to do with entrepreneurship and investment, but just to start, we consider the team as a key element. It is considered that they board a real problematic, how scalable the solution is, that the technology is scalable into a business model, that it's attractive, that it has a good product market fit, the value of the investment. Nowadays, due to a restriction that we have in the industry of these kind of investments globally, the prices of the startups are going down, and punctually the intellectual property as a relevant factor is important. All these decisions that we make and that are generally done are assessed based on how organized and how well protected are the different intangible assets in terms of the company that we're investing on. Just as a way of example,
in all of the investments that have a patent or intellectual property, it's typical for the entrepreneur to tell you, I have everything protected, I've presented patents, and so don't worry. We generate a service called a Go No Go, which is very simple, and what it does is, with regards to what the entrepreneur says, and we provide this service to several research funds in Chile, we validate 3 questions with regards to the patents. First, something obvious and natural to everyone here, but the subject matters that is protected, that is actually protectable, because we may be told it's protected by a patent, but it turns out what they want to protect is not a patent subject matter. So 2, that vindications that they develop really cover the technology, because they might say, yes, I have the patent presented, but it turns out this technology is not what is actually represented. And it happened last week that we've kept or maintained all of the deadlines to internationalize the patents and that they haven't been lost. With those 3 points, we can say that we can follow or proceed with an investment process. It's just so that you have an idea that the subject of intellectual property and capital is relevant. And now we'll talk about the world of startups. We consulted around 5 startups, but 2 that I'll highlight, where here we have multiple people from Argentina, surely, and they will recognize this startup called Tienda Nube, founded by Santiago Sosa, and which is one of the first startups in gathering a round and being valued in $3.5 billion. You may know that there are valuations that lead a company to become a unicorn, which that means that it's worth $1 billion, which is brutal. So this one is 3.5 billion, and Santi Sosa developed it, created it, has over 100,000 clients, so many people employed, and it's a company that we'll see when you ask these questions that we want to understand how it was impacted or not by its ability to obtain private financing for what it does. And for everyone in Chile who knows it, with Betterfly, an insurance tech of the first to become unicorns in Chile, which we also know quite well, and which have had an amazing development and success. When we speak to the two of them and with others, we ask 3 questions, and the questions are here. The first is, in the process, along the way of going from an early stage company where you got money from friends, family, and fans, to becoming a billion-dollar company, did you obtain banking or financing? And the responses were quite clear. No, never. We were financed by credit, or it was always with equity and investment, venture capital. 2, it was never a real alternative. It was impossible. In fact, for many startups to open a normal account is quite a challenge, or the only challenge that, or the only credit that we take was a passive loan, but it is a way of investing, and so the answer is a no. Then the brands, authors' rights, and other assets, intellectual property, do you have these accounted for? I have to check with the controller, but we're 99% sure that they're only at cost, if we have them at all. If we don't have these assets well accounted for in the companies, it will be difficult for companies and financial institutions to consider them collaterals.
El tema de valor de mercado,
I've never talked about market value, and we're trying to organize these matters, and so we've just started to work with Pricewaterhouse, for example. So those are just some of the responses that we get. And then what proportion of your values do you attribute to tangible assets? And this again reminds us of what's happening with this economy of knowledge. It's difficult to talk about these. And the only tangible thing in our case is the cash flow position. It's the only thing we have are the coins and the bills that I have in the bank. And so the rest of the value tends to be intangible. And so for me, 99% is these startups have their value in intangible assets. To these companies that are worth $1 billion or 3.5 billion, most of that value easily is in intangible resources or assets. And so are we using that adequately? Each of you will have to see this. What are our challenges? This aligns with the framework. These are challenges that we've talked about with entrepreneurs, that we've talked about with banking. And first, of course, is the accounting management, that the balance sheets don't record the adequate value of these assets to the adequate management of these intangible assets. With this, I mean, imagine that, of course, none of the people here have gone through this, but it's possible that a brand that has to be renewed, it was lost, and a patent that had to pay something annual in Canada, it wasn't paid, that the secret that I had stored is lost. And nowadays, when we're saying that we have to provide this kind of guarantee, and we have poor management, it's a no-brainer that I as an institution won't participate in that game. What use is it for me to have a patent if it is infringed upon and I cannot act against these people, or I never find out? These are important things to think about. And then I go to standards of valuation and methods. I know Fernando will give us an excellent talk about how to value these types of assets. Something interesting that we discovered slowly was that patents generally have a problem with the unit of value. A patent in particular can have a determined value in conjunction with other intangible assets and other equipment that handles it. That same patent and technology, without those intangible assets and the right team, its value can be very different. So it's not that we have a value per se of a technology. It all depends on how we use it and in what context we have it. We still lack liquidity and banking regulations of the financial industry in general is lacking. With this, I'm concluding, Gabriel, but I'd just like to mention that, as Marcus taught me in Singapore and in China, what I've found is surprising. China has developed a lot around the use of intangible assets, technologies for the reduction of the rate of interest of bank loans, for example. So if you have intellectual property, you can get lower rates. Increase the funds provided. Now, these things have led to, just in 1 year, more than 4 billion. Remember the AFCA? 4 billion were loaned to multiple companies in a province in China based on patent collaterals. So there is a giant opportunity here, and hopefully OMPI and the policymakers can continue moving along this path. This is a quote that I think summarizes this very well. It says that the only way for this to happen is coordinated unity among different parties, policymakers, banking industry, financial industry, and all types of service providers. And so without further ado, I hope I've given you some clear information. Unfortunately, the news isn't as good as we would like, but now we will continue with Fernando. Thank you, Allan. It's marvelous. This shows us how much we have yet to do. Such interesting ideas you've shared with us. Fernando has a professional trajectory that's very interesting. He's founded the company CompassBranding, which are companies who carry out brand evaluation, helping businessmen to define strategies to develop the value of their brands. Fernando has studied business strategy program of Columbia University, MBA in Temple University. He's an economist of the University of Los Andes in Bogotá.
Mucho curso.
Has presented many courses, written over 30 articles, and what's especially interesting to us is that for over 20 years he's been author of studies of the most valuable brands in Colombia, published with categories of services and brand portfolios. In 2021, he's published a similar study, the brands of the football teams in Colombia. And for those of you who don't know, the game has ended 4-1, Brazil-Korea. And so now we'll hear from him. Hello. First of all, it is an honor to have been invited to this panel, because I know that I am with the elite of intellectual property, and what I'm going to share here is, because we work hand in hand with lawyers all of the time, and with people like you who protect intellectual property. And I'd like to begin to allude to something that I found in international standards for financial information, I think NIFS. It says that intangible assets arise from contractual rights. And if you read 31 of the NIFS, you might reach the conclusion that without legal support, intangible assets don't exist. And another thing we'd find is that in terms of valuation of intangible assets, that in order to value them, it must be likely, or it must be possible for the economic benefits to flow to an entity. And they specifically mention the method of discounting flows of future monies arising from the asset. There's a book called Capitalism Without Capital, which makes an interesting differentiation between tangible and intangible assets. I'm going to skip this slide, which repeats what's already been said regarding the importance of investment in intangible assets. It's worth mentioning that authors are surprised by the fact that national accounts don't register that investment in intangibles. But I'll repeat what's most interesting, which is that authors detect or define the differences of intangible assets with 3 S's. And we'll look one by one at these. Advantages and disadvantages. We'll start with the advantages. Scalability. What the authors say is that one of the characteristics of tangible assets is that when they reach their capacity, if you want to continue growing, you have to expand a factory or buy more land, which doesn't happen with intangible assets. TikTok last year was downloaded 365 million times, and there's no limit to that. Synergies. You've already talked about the synergies between among intangible assets, and this is important, which is unique to these. The loyalty program, Advantage, which has alliances with 15 airlines, 100 million affiliates, and produces $6 billion with a margin of over 50%. Let's look at the disadvantages, and this has to do in part with the fact that financial entities don't like to finance while using intangible assets as collateral. The first is spillovers, which means when a liquid spills from a recipient, and what the authors refer to here is a tangible asset is easy to protect from it being used through electronic means. But the same thing doesn't happen with intangible assets. And the case that's been mentioned multiple times, the iPhone, the design of the iPhone, despite patents and industrial secrets, nowadays design has been copied by all types of competitors, like the ones I'm showing here.
Y el último es sunkness, es un término...
The last one is sunkness, which is the value of salvaging. If after some time you want to sell a property, a piece of land or an office, there's always someone interested in giving it a different use. And this is why real estate is so popular among banks, and the term of mortgaging is so popular. This is an interesting case of Lehman Brothers, which went broke, and within the bankruptcy, the liquidator was able to use all of the tangible assets, the offices, the financial investments to pay part of the debt, but the intangible assets lost value.
Foto porque es...
And this picture is funny because the Lehman Brothers sign in the building, and it was auctioned off for $65,000. The examples of intangibles are countless, and you know this, but I'll show this list just to say that a great part of the work that we do in valuing brands and intangible assets, and I use brands or trademarks because it's the most studied intangible asset. We're always discovering new intangible assets, and there's an anecdote. We were hired by an iron products company, and we discovered something called the possession of waste but spare parts wastes. Basically, we identify this, we analyze it, we explain it and value it, and it helped in a transaction to support an intangible assets and reduce the taxes to be paid. And I didn't include goodwill, and the reason why I don't include goodwill is this, which is a quote from the columnist Schumpeter in The Economist. When referring to concepts with inappropriate names, goodwill is among the first on the list. What is goodwill? It says it represents the difference between the price paid for acquiring a company and its value on books. And so goodwill was a convenient name that we came up with to describe something that we really didn't know what it was. But in reality, it's a set of intangible assets, and our challenge is to identify them, characterize them, and so basically we identified 9 companies, and we look at the market value, and in financial statements we found that if we look at the tangible assets reflected, plant and property and working capital, if we subtract them, we find the following. The 5 companies at the top have their percentage of intangible assets is above 90%, while in the bottom it exceeds 63% in the case of 35% in the case of General Electric, which is high. And so we have to, I guess, preach about this subject. I'll show you a short video, a 2-minute video about the 100 most valuable brands from Interbrand, which is one of the leaders in trademark valuation.
Ahora, ¿cómo se valoran esas?
And so how are these brands valued? Interbrands, as I mentioned, are leaders and pioneers on this. And so we'll talk about the method that we use to value these brands and other assets. And the first point is the value, and I mentioned there are many differences in this, but this has to do with the fact that depending on our assumptions and interests, if I want to use the brand as a legal shield, I need it to have an infinite life. If I want to sell it, I want a higher value, of course, and there are three focuses for valuing these brands, and I'll focus on economic contribution because it's the most precise. And the step is the following. First, the question that we always ask our clients is the brand protected? Are the intangible assets protected? This is a necessary condition, and then a financial analysis, which is basically a discounted cash flow, the role of the brand in its intangibles, and the strength of the brand, which is the risk profile. The cash flow is very interesting. It's simple. You can estimate a projection of cash flow in a company, and since the assets are registered in financial statements, I know what the cost of opportunity is for each company, for each sector. I multiply by the value of the tangible assets, and this is what they contribute, what is great at the bottom, and thereby, for the difference, it corresponds to their intangible assets. That's the first step. And how is it done? By looking at the promoters of the business, through the business drivers and the dependents on the brand. This is a real example of a chain that we made. And through surveys, the clients told us that there were 6 important engines with that relative importance, and I will refer to the dependency of the first 2. First of all, publicity has a dependency 100% on the brand, and the price, as a client makes a decision based on price, they won't care about the brand. And this is the analysis that we do. And the role of the brand has a weight of 40% among intangibles, and the risk profile of the brand strength is measured looking at the leadership, the geographic coverage, legal protection, and reputation. And this is another example qualified through the market research, high leadership, and this means that there's an adjustment made as the brand strength grows. The adjustment is discounted at a lower rate. And so we have the weighted average cost of capital went from 15% to 18%. So if it had been 50 over 100, it would have doubled. And this is the summary, very much a summary of a brand valuation on a spreadsheet. But this is the summary. And what we see at the top is the revenue minus the expenses, minus taxes, and it gives you a general cash flow of the company in relation to its normal activity. And I'll repeat, since we know the value of the tangible assets because it's in financial statements, we apply the weighted average cost of capital, and this gives us the capital charge, which is then subtracted from 9E, the cash flow, and by difference, the rest has to come from intangible assets, and then we apply that 40% that I showed you was calculated, and we subtract it, and it gives us this value. On the right, we see perpetuity. This is very important, especially in the next slides, and I'll explain why. Because here we are assuming that the brand has an indefinite life. So perpetuity is a financial formula to calculate with. But clients have shown up that say, I need to amortize the brand that I've just acquired. And the standards say this: an intangible asset with a finite life can be amortized. If it has an indefinite life, we can't, but we have to test. And so we do the same exercise, but without perpetuity. But since these have 10 years of duration, then we assume that the brand is going to up to 10 years, and this is how we can amortize. Now the value will be lower, of course. And so for royalties, it's the same exercise, and we can calculate how much we can charge for licensing a brand. In the case of Juan Valdez, it's very interesting because the Juan Valdez brand was licensed through the Coffee Growers Federation, which is called Pro Café Col. So you can see the history of the royalties paid by Pro Café Col to the Coffee Growers Federation, and you can easily clarify this, bring this to a present value, and you'll find the value of Juan Valdez, which is included in our study with this methodology. And valuing a patent is exactly the same, but in Colombia, a patent lasts 20 years, and so here there's a negative cash flow at the beginning due to developments and the like, but there's something quite interesting. And where do we get 60%, which is the role of the patent within the cash flow of the intangibles? The example that I like to use is Viagra, which is a very well-known product, but it lost its patent, and as soon as they lost it, their revenue fell apart. Competition shows up and started to take market share from them. They had to lower prices. But this is the history of the revenue of Viagra. And so if we look at the top before its collapse, as soon as the patent stopped existing, that's the revenue that corresponds to the patent. The rest is brand, and surely other intangibles. But in this type of analysis, this is what we use to find out what the role of the patent is. And I'll conclude
with a simple reflection, which is what we believe that we must preach amongst the regulation institutes and financial institutes, and it's that the brands are go further than a simple trademark, a social symbol, or a name. They are key differentiators. They guarantee future incomes through the loyalty of clients and exclusive rights. Most of the consultants worldwide say that the brands have the power of changing the world. That's why I want to finish with another video over a very interesting story of one of the most valuable brands that we saw. And it will last just a few moments. It's about Chanel.
Origins all her life and preferred to invent her own legend. Once upon a time, Gabrielle Chanel was born under the sign of the Leo to a traveling peddler and a laundress who died at 32, exhausted by life. Once upon a time, there was a father who abandoned his 5 children and had his 3 daughters sent away to an orphanage. At 12 years old, Gabrielle would never see him again. Forever after, she pretended that he had left to make his way in America. Once upon a time, there was an orphanage behind the walls of a convent, the Abbey of Obazine, where Gabrielle spent nearly 7 years. The Romanesque purity of this ascetic world would inspire her sense of austerity and her taste for black and white, while the opulence of religious garments and ceremonial objects would spark her fascination with Baroque style, gold and colored gems in years to come. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young girl who spent her days sewing and her nights singing in a cabaret before troops of cavalrymen. She was called Coco because she often sang "Who's Seen Coco" in the Trocadero. She always preferred to pretend that Coco was the nickname given to her by her father. Once upon a time, a young woman with a boyish allure refused to ride side saddle on the horses of a well-born cavalier, Etienne Balzon. She dressed like no one else, taking her inspiration from masculine attire and inventing new styles of hat, which she stripped off their birds and feathers to make them simpler, lighter, more chic. Her first clients were working girls, but society quickly followed. Once upon a time, there was a great love named Boy Capel, English, wealthy, and cultivated. He was the man of her dreams. He introduced her to literature, the Orient, and the esoteric. Boy helped Coco become Chanel. She decided to open her first boutiques in Paris, Deauville, and Biarritz. She wanted to work to win her liberty. Once upon a time, a revolution came to pass when, in a stroke of genius, Coco Chanel transformed the female silhouette. She shortened dresses, revealed ankles, freed the waist, eliminated corsets, revived jersey, cut her hair, and bronzed her skin. Chanel closed one era and launched a new century of fashion. Once upon a time, at 31 Rue Cambon, Mademoiselle Chanel opened her first couture house in Paris in 1918. The little country girl, the orphan of Aubezine, had become the queen of Paris. Before liberating women, she had liberated herself. Once upon a time, there was a love story that ended abruptly. Boy Capel died in a car accident. For the first and last time, Coco Chanel was seen to cry. "Either I die as well," she said, "or I finish what we started together." She chose to go on.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Very well. Thank you very much, Fernando. A very interesting speech, and I believe that we all have many things to learn around evaluation. And of course, towards the end, this demonstrates that before all, brands have an emotional connection, and nothing can be more valuable than this. I can see around the first row 3 ex-presidents of ASIPI. I want to ask them if one of them wants to make a question. We still have time for one question. And I give a preference to the ex-presidents. Martin Michels, please, go ahead. Thank you very much. It's for this educational and creative presentation. Within this analysis, how do you contemplate the possibility of giving the scheme of assessment, or would it be another topic when we talk about domains? Could they be spoken under this structure? Could they be sources of financing? Or does it escape from this analysis? Allan, Jarry, you want to start? Now, if the topic of assessment presents immense complexity, now the names of domains presents a bigger challenge, because from the optic of intellectual property, it's not an independent category, but we know that it has a very high profile. Now, we can take the example of American Airlines. When American Airlines had this access to a credit of $1 billion recently, within the goods that were used as a warranty, they had the brands and other identifiers, including the names of domains. Therefore, I believe that it makes part of that reference that we were previously doing, where we take a whole, but it's difficult to go into an individual evaluation. I believe that many of the rules that Fernando showed us started with a question: is it protected? I believe it would have a difficulty of answer from the category of intellectual property to give an answer, and that was the condition. Okay, if I could try to complement, I believe that there is an immense difference between the brands and the names of domains, because when we're talking about brands, we're surely talking about a right of property. But what happens with the name of a domain is that these are complementary issues to a brand, because the property comes from the brand. Therefore, we could only talk of a category an autonomous, isolated category of evaluation of a name of a domain related to the names of domains that are formed by generic terms, which don't have a predefined property, because the name of a domain, for example Chanel.com, doesn't have any value if you don't have that brand of Chanel behind it. Therefore, I believe that the challenges are greater, just as Marco has said, with the topic of domain names. I am sure that there is a value, but to organize this, it would imply to board a much greater and challenging issue. Very well. It was a wonderful speech. We would have loved to continue an hour more. But please, ladies and gentlemen, for the next time, ask the organizers to give more time to the topic of assessment. But I have to finish, or else the next workshop will be delayed. Therefore, I want to thank once again the members that we have today here. It's been an honor to be with you, and until the next time, thank you.
Vamos a dar inicio.
Very well. We will start in a moment. There won't be a break. There is no space for coffee. We will take the pictures and we will begin with our next panel.